Welcome to Science Cafe. This is an event brought to you by the Southeastern Center for Conservation at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. And tonight we're very happy to have with us Mr. Nick DiLuzio, who is the Vice President of the Georgia Forestry Foundation. And he will be presenting on fire in the forest, the importance of fire to Georgia's forests. Before we get started, just want to let you all know a few things. We are going to have a question and answer section at the end of this, after Nick's talk. And we just ask if you have any questions, if you could please direct those to the question and answer feature that says Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to get as many of those questions answered for you as we can. Also, I'd like to let you all know that we are recording this event tonight, and it will be available on our website, and I will share at the end of the talk the link to that website. So if you have any friends or family who are unable to attend that you think might like to see this, we'll be able to share that with them. Other than that, just want to introduce Nick and let you all know a little bit about him. So Nick DiLuzio is a certified forester and serves as the Vice President of the Georgia Forestry Foundation, where he leads the foundation's growth efforts as it continues to expand its body of work that will ensure the long-term success of Georgia's 22 million acres of private working forest. Nick has a bachelor's in biology with a focus on ecology from Davidson College and a master's degree in environmental management and forestry from the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. While at Duke, Nick's thesis work focused on longleaf pine management and restoration of the red-cockaded woodpecker population in coastal North Carolina. As part of his graduate work, Nick earned his red card, that's a wildland firefighter certification, and fell in love and became obsessed with fire. So again, Nick, we're very happy to have you here with us this evening, and I give you the floor.
Great, thanks, Ian. Let me get the screen shared. All right, hopefully you all can see that.
Looks good.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining. Really excited to be here tonight and give y'all a brief overview of fire in Georgia and how awesome it really is. So, as a brief overview of what I'll touch on tonight, I'll give you a really quick introduction to the Georgia Forestry Foundation, since you all may not be aware of who we are or what we do. And then we'll get into fun stuff, a Fire Ecology 101 lesson, brief history of fire management, because that's important to understand the history and where we are today. And then we'll talk about fire as a management tool for land. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about, kind of compare and contrast fires that we have here in Georgia versus the fires that we hear about a lot on the news out west and some of the differences there. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with questions. So Ian mentioned in the introduction, but the Georgia Forestry Foundation, we were founded in 1989. And the foundation itself was created in response to the rapid urbanization that the state, and especially Atlanta, were experiencing. So when you look at why we exist, it's ultimately to ensure the long-term sustainability of Georgia's 22 million acres of working forest. Georgia is the #1 state in the country in terms of privately owned working forest, with that 22 million acres. And so we want to make sure that the forest land that we do have stays as forest land. And we do that by really positioning forests as an at-scale solution to the greatest challenges that our state and country are facing. So when you think about certainly a lot of the climate challenges we're facing now, but along with sustainability and jobs and workforce and clean water, forests and working forests especially are a existing at-scale solution to those challenges. Now we work in 3 different program areas. The first is education and leadership, which is what we're here doing tonight, and that's really focused on connecting Georgians, both youth and adults, back to the land and to our 22 million acres of forest. Environmental sustainability really focuses on maximizing forests as a climate, water, and wildlife solution. And then economic competitiveness, where our work there focuses on ensuring the economic resiliency and competitiveness of forests and forestry in Georgia. Now I'll give a couple quick facts on Georgia's forests. So Georgia has just over 24 million acres of forest land across the state. Just about 90%, so 22 million acres of those are privately owned. And in the charts, you can see here a breakdown of the ownership of those 24 million acres. So you can see that orange slice is that 9% of public land. And at the bottom, you can see a breakdown of the composition of those forests. So roughly about a third of them are planted pine, and that's certainly what you see when you drive through middle and South Georgia. And then the rest, the remaining 3/4 of forest in Georgia, are a mix of hardwood and natural pine and bottomlands and an oak pine mix. So we are the #1 state in the country for forestry. We have 22 million acres of forest land. But between 2014 and 2019, we lost about 1 billion trees of our forest land in those 5 years. Now, despite losing those trees, the volume of our trees increased by about 4 billion cubic feet. So while we have fewer trees, the trees that we do have are getting bigger, and that there's some economic factors there. But on average in Georgia, we lose about 118,000 acres of forest land due to conversion to non-forest uses. And so, going forward, these are the acres that we want to keep, make sure that we can keep as forest land. Now, forests in this state, whether you know it or not, they touch every Georgian across the state benefits from our forests in a number of different ways. About 60% of Georgians depend on water from forests. Forests are great at providing clean water and reducing treatment costs on water utilities. And then about a quarter, 23% of Georgia's carbon emissions from fossil fuels are sequestered by Georgia's forests every year. So in terms of clean air and clean water, there's no better solution out there than forest. That's the brief overview of who we are. So now we'll jump into the fun stuff, and we'll start with a quick lesson on fire ecology 101, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. So why fire? A couple different reasons. So many ecosystems in the South, and especially forests, depend on it. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It's an important, if not the most important, management tool for land managers and foresters, especially here in the South. It's a hot topic. That pun is intended, especially out west. We hear about it a lot in the media. And it's a good thing most of the time. But above all, fire is awesome. Now this is very much a staged photo of me, but this was an actual controlled burn that I worked back on the Duke University forest years ago. Really, when I fell in love with fire. So when we think about fire, there's a couple different types of fire. And it's important to understand the different types and different goals associated with each. So surface fires are those in fire lingo, we'll call those cool fires. So surface fires, they burn the upper litter layer and small branches on the ground. These are lower intensity, hence the cool fires, and fast moving. So these move quick. They don't burn a lot of big stuff, but they can burn or girdle, which basically means that they'll eventually kill small trees and shrubs in the understory, but larger trees and plants are not harmed by these fires. So the picture that you see here on this slide, it's also the one that's in my Zoom background, is the Green Swamp Preserve in coastal North Carolina. This is where I did my master's work. So this is an example of a surface fire. Ground fires are similar to surface fires. They're cool, they're low intensity fires, but they're slow. So they move slowly through the litter, and they'll also move through and burn the humus, so their organic layers. So ground fires left on their own can consume pretty much all of the organic cover down to mineral soil, and these fires can burn for weeks or months. And so several years ago, we had some big fires a big fire in the Okefenokee swamp, and that burned for a very long time. That was a ground fire because it got down in the peat and just kind of kept burning and burning until it got down to the organic base layer. And then crown fires, these are what you see when you see news reports of fires out west. These are very hot fires. They're very fast moving fires. And so these are crown fires when a surface or ground fire spreads up the tree and into the tree canopy and basically engulfs everything in its path. That's a crown fire. And it's also important to think, especially when we think about fire as a tool, to think about timing. And this relates to prescribed fire. So when we do prescribed burning, you can have a growing season fire, and that's a fire that is done in the summer when plants are actively growing, versus a dormant season. It's just that those are fires that are in the fall, winter, very early spring, and depending on your objectives of a prescribed fire, will kind of dictate timing on if you want to do a dormant season burn or a growing season burn. In addition to fire type, there's fire return interval, and fire regime is really important as we think about the role that fire plays in the ecosystem, especially here in the South. So fire return interval and fire regimes are sometimes used interchangeably, but they really relate to the spatial and temporal patterns of fire. So the fire return interval specifically focuses on how frequently, on average, fire returns to the landscape or to an ecosystem. The fire regime has a little bit more of a focus on the impact and severity of the fire. And there's really two key factors that play into determining what that fire return interval and fire regime is, and that's vegetation type and weather and climate patterns. So you can see on this slide the map of the US. Georgia is pretty much entirely in that light blue color, which is those lower intensity, understory fires on a 0 to 10 year on average interval. If you look out to, and then even in the far kind of northeast Georgia mountains, it starts to get into a little bit of the dark blue, but as we get in the hardwood forests in Georgia, there's still a 0 to 10, maybe 0 to 20 year interval as we get up into the Appalachians. And then as you look out to California, especially Northern California and some of the inland portions of the state, they have a very similar fire return interval to what we see in Georgia. Frequent, low intensity understory fires. And then as we move up to the Pacific Northwest, you can see those pink and purple colors. As you can imagine, they get a lot of rain up there. Conditions aren't favorable for fires. They don't have a lot of fire, but when they do, they're big ones. And so they have the pinks and purples that you can see. Those are stand replacement fires that anywhere on a 200 to 500 year interval, which essentially means every 200 to 500 years, massive fire will come through. These are crown fires. They'll basically burn everything, kind of hit the reset button on those forests. And as we look a little bit closer to Georgia, this is a little bit of a noisy slide since it's a screenshot from Wildfire. But even with Georgia on this, the previous slide showed a 0 to 10 year fire interval across the state. And as you zoom in and start looking a little more, a little bit finer detail, you can see that there's a gradation of the fire regime across the state. So we can see the fall line of the Piedmont pretty clearly stretching across Georgia and South Carolina. So really down in the coastal plain of Georgia, it's a 1 to 3 year fire return interval. It's pretty frequent. And then as we head further north up into the Piedmont and then up into the foothills, the return interval gets less frequent, but even then it's still a 6 to 10 year interval. So really what this says is, fire is a part of the landscape in Georgia, and it's an important part of the landscape. And because of the frequent fire return interval, especially in the coastal plain, there's a lot of species, both plant and animal species, that are not just adapted to, but I'd argue are dependent on fire. So while I might be biased, perhaps the best known of these kind of fire dependent species are longleaf pine and the red-cockaded woodpecker. So the pictures here we're taking, these are longleaf pine stand at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. The picture on the left, I'm climbing a kind of rickety, flimsy ladder up a longleaf pine. Right above the ladder, you can see a white kind of sap stained area where there's a red-cockaded woodpecker cavity. So checking the cavity, and then on the right, banding some of the baby red-cockaded woodpecker chicks. But this is an example of an ecosystem of both plant and animal that, if fires were removed from the landscape, they really can't and won't survive. And that's now why red-cockaded woodpeckers are a endangered species. So I mentioned I'm maybe a little biased towards the longleaf pine. That's probably my favorite tree and was the focus of a lot of my research. And I think it's just, such an incredible plant and tree species. And I could do a whole talk just on the longleaf pine growth cycle, and I won't potentially bore you all with that. But in talking about how the longleaf pine itself is adapted to fire, the picture that you see on the left of the slide is a baby longleaf pine tree in what's called the grass stage. So the needles that you can see, it looks like a little tuft of grass on the ground. The needles are surrounding the growth bud of the tree, while the root system develops underground. These are sandy soils, and so the longleaf can spend up to 7 years in the grass stage, where it'll look like this the entire time. Its roots are growing underground and establishing, and if one of those low intensity surface fires run through the area, it might singe or burn the needles, but the needles will protect that growth bud, which is the most important part. And then the needles will regrow and continue to protect that bud. And then after up to 7 years in the grass stage, once the roots are established, the tree will enter what I call the rocket stage. Some people call it the bottle brush stage, but you can kind of see it here in this picture on the right, where the pines will shoot up. Longleaf are not known for being fast growers, but in this stage, they do have relatively quick vertical growth, and so their vertical growth will increase significantly, and that's primarily to increase access to sunlight over surrounding competitors. You can kind of see some mixed scrub hardwoods mixed in with the stand. So they want to try and get above those hardwoods so they get access to the sun. But it's also to get the bud above kind of typical flame heights, to prevent against death during a more severe burn. So again, the needles are still there around the growth bud to protect it. But during the stage, the bark is still fairly thin and hasn't fully developed, so they are a little more vulnerable to fire during the stage. But then once the trees get to anywhere from 6 to 10 feet in height, the bark is kind of fully thickened as a protection, and the lateral branches will begin to grow. And so in the background of this picture, you can see some of the older trees as they start to develop their lateral branching and continue growth. So, I'm I think the longleaf is just such an amazing and really cool tree, but it's certainly not the only kind of fire adapted or fire dependent species out there. So there's, like I mentioned, a number of plants and animals that benefit. There's a couple examples here on the slide. So, quail and gopher tortoise and pitcher plants and the indigo snake and some of the native orchids. For all these different species, fire is such a vital part to ensuring the success of these species, and many of which that are featured here on the slide have become threatened or endangered since the removal of fire from Georgia. So when we think about fire management in Georgia, it's really important that we take a step back and look at a really brief history of fire management in the US, because that really kind of tells the story of how we got to where we are now. So for anybody out there that's really interested and wants to learn more about the history of fire in the US, Stephen Pine is a professor at Arizona State, probably one of the top historians in the country on the history of fire and the role of fire in the American landscape. And this is a quote that I pulled from one of his books, and I won't read it verbatim, but it basically says that since humans kind of captured fire over 1.5 million years ago, we control it now. Fire's always been in the landscape, but its expression has changed as new climate, new people, and new land uses have become predominant, and that's even more true today. So thinking, since the inception of humanity, humans have always exerted an influence on fire, and that's either by igniting fire, suppressing it, or controlling it. So the Native Americans, as Pine notes in some of his writings, are known for their widespread use of fire. So Pine noted that Native Americans are known to have burned grass fields every 1 to 3 years on rotation. They've burned brush and forest every 7 to 10 years. So they were using fire for a number of purposes, but one of them was clearly to manage the land. And then about 500-ish years ago, when European settlers arrived, they continued the use of fire, and use of fire as a tool. Now, certainly wasn't just for forestry. They used it for agricultural purposes, livestock, clear land, etc. But fire was a really important tool for them. And then around the turn of the century, the late 1800s, very early 1900s, there was a kind of extensive logging boom, especially here in the South. Between 1880 and 1920, annual lumber production in the South rose from 1.6 billion board feet to 15.4 billion board feet. That's a 860% growth over a 20-year period. So there's just a lot of logging going on across the region. And as they would log, they would leave the slash, the branches, and everything else that they didn't want in piles on the land. And these slash piles are either they would burn them to clear them, or they would naturally catch fire. So we had a lot of fire and wildfire popping up around the turn of the century here in the South. But then we also had a couple pretty significant wildfires out west. And so around the early 1900s, the use of fire as a tool really kind of phased out, and we entered an era of widespread fire suppression. And in the early 1900s, the U.S. Forest Service adopted a policy of total fire suppression. And again, that was largely in response to some extensive fires in the South, and then also several large fires out west. So in 1935, the Forest Service enacted what's referred to as the 10 a.m. rule, that said all fires should be suppressed by 10 a.m. the following morning. In 1944, Smokey Bear, who we all know, was created by the Forest Service to deliver its fire prevention message. So, you know, a lot of people love Smokey Bear. Some foresters have some mixed feelings about Smokey because, you know, the Forest Service really dominated fire policy and directed what amounted to be a national fire suppression policy. And so, you know, they were directing significant federal funds towards fire suppression. In 1930, the Forest Service had allocated $5 million to fire suppression. That may not seem like much, but in today's dollars, it's about $85 million. So it's a pretty significant amount. And that grew steadily through the 1960s. And then during that same time, state funding for wildfire suppression also increased significantly from 10 million in 1930 up to 900 million plus in the 1980s. And so, you know, during that time, in response, the burning decreased significantly. You know, in 1930, there were approximately 2 million acres of timberland burned. And in 1983, it dropped down to about 280,000 acres. And this is nationally. So while the focus of the policy was on wildfire and suppressing wildfire, in turn, you know, really ended up also suppressing and removing controlled or prescribed fire from the landscape, which had some pretty detrimental impacts. But then, you know, beginning in the 1980s, they realized that, you know, removing fire from the landscape, especially here in the South, was and is unrealistic and was really having some detrimental impacts to the forest, but also the ecosystems they support. So a lot of those plant and wildlife species that I highlighted earlier. Fighting fire and the kind of the suppression policy was becoming increasingly more and more expensive. And so in 1994, the government spent just shy of $1 billion in fire suppression. So there's a lot of money and a lot of resources going into this. And so in 1995, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Departments of the Interior announced a joint federal policy to restore fire to the land. And in doing so, they shifted a lot of the responsibility from the federal government to the states and other cooperators. And so this really kind of instituted a return to the landscape, return of fires to the landscape. And since then, the role of prescribed fire and fire management has increased. So, you know, the one of the best ways to reduce the threat of fire is prescribed fire. You know, it's not always possible, and it still has its challenges that we'll touch on. But now, you know, we're thankfully in this era of fire management and starting to you know, understand that its importance to the landscape. So, you know, I've talked a lot about fire as a tool, and it is probably the most effective tool that not just foresters but land managers have in land management. So fire can reduce fuel loads. This is the, you know, accumulated sticks and logs and debris and you know, things that burn easily. It can reduce those fuel loads to reduce the severity of future fires. It minimizes insects and disease on trees in the landscape. It's a great tool in removing invasive species, which a lot of our native species can't compete with on their own. It improves habitat for a number of plant and animal species, recycles nutrients back into the soil, reduces competition from other plants and competing species, which results in bigger and better trees. And it's a great tool, you know, especially after a harvest in preparing sites for planting. But, you know, so most importantly, more prescribed fire, you know, will results in fewer extreme wildfires. And to give you all a sense of what a stand looks like with fire and without fire, the picture you see on the left is this is from a property kind of down outside Warner Robins in Middle Georgia. And so the picture on the left, while it's managed for wildlife and not so much for timber, it's burned on a 2 to 3 year rotation. Just looking at the picture, it's due for another burn. It's got some kind of pretty dense understory coming up. So, it'll be burned again soon, but you contrast that with the stand on the right, and they're right across that dirt road from each other. That's a stand that hasn't been burned or had any other management. And so as you look through, even though the pines are denser, you can see that there's a lot more shrubs and scrub trees and other kind of woody understory coming in. So this, hopefully gives a sense of what a stand looks like with fire and without, that are two stands right next to each other. And this is, again, another picture from a property in middle Georgia. And again, this property, it's managed for wildlife, not necessarily timber, because the trees are not very dense, but they burn it every 2 years for quail, for hunting. And so you can see that it's got that great kind of grass and herbaceous understory without any of the hardwoods or other kind of competitor species coming in. So fire's a great tool, but with fire removed from the landscape, the same objectives of fire still have to be achieved in management. And so there's some other tools out there that can be used. Those being primarily chemical spraying and mechanical treatment or chipping. And so while both of these methods are effective, they're really not nearly as effective as fire, and in a lot of cases they're a lot more expensive. So it's really hard to effectively replace fire in the landscape. But despite all the benefits of fire, and especially prescribed burning, it still has its challenges. So there is, I think, a general perception out there, at least from the general public, that fire and fire in the forest is bad. And while that's certainly the case, and the case with some of those fires out west, prescribed fire is good. It benefits the environment. It helps the forest. It's a great tool, but the media is certainly not helping us out there. Smoke's a challenge in dealing with prescribed fire. There's a lot of local ordinances that vary by county, where some, especially in South Georgia, most counties are fires, prescribed burning is kind of a part of ordinary life, and it happens all the time. Whereas other counties, the ordinances around fire make it harder and more challenging to burn. Here in Georgia, we have burn bans, and so some counties, granted they're in the metro area, so not really a hot bed for prescribed fire, but still, there are some restrictions around burning in the state. And then, proximity to roads, highways, and other development can create challenges in trying to burn land and burn property. And so really lands that are closer to residential communities and kind of urban centers or town centers, makes it a little bit more challenging to burn there. But again, it's really in the best interest of everybody to allow for prescribed burning in Georgia. But the challenges that we face that I've outlined here really pale in comparison to what we're seeing out west. And since fires in the west are in the news, it seems like almost constantly every fire season, I thought I'd kind of end on some of the why we don't see those big fires here in Georgia that we see out west. So wildfire in Georgia, a lot of you may not realize this, but Georgia averages over 2,300 wildfires each year. Now, the average size of those is about 7 acres. So they're not those really big, high intensity fires that we see out west. They don't get a whole lot of coverage in the media. We do occasionally have some bigger ones pop up, like in the Okefenokee a couple years ago. But we have a lot of fire, and those fires are small and low intensity. And that there's a couple reasons for that. Probably the biggest one is the way that we do actively manage our forests here in Georgia, because we do so much prescribed burning, and we harvest a lot of our timberland. That leads to these low intensity fires that we do have. The Georgia Forestry Commission, the state forestry agency, really is a fire agency. So their number one focus is fire. They fight wildland fires, but then they also do a lot of support with landowners on prescribed burning across the state. So maintaining, working with landowners to maintain fire breaks, so that if there is a fire, prevents it from spreading. They'll help landowners develop burn plans. They'll even assist landowners with actual prescribed burns. Now, the commission cannot ignite the fire. They can't walk around with the drip torches for liability reasons. But they're often out there with landowners, helping them manage their land. And like I've mentioned a couple of times, really prescribed burning plays a key role in wildfire mitigation, not just in Georgia, but across the Southeast. So annually, roughly about 75% of all prescribed burning in the country happens right here in the Southeast. Now, that's certainly not the case from the West. So this is a quote I pulled from a press release the U.S. Forest Service actually released on Tuesday. So very timely for me in this presentation. But I was reading through it and I saw this, and I think it summed it up well, saying, and this is the U.S. Forest Service saying this, that overgrown forests, a warming climate, and a growing number of homes in the wildland-urban interface, following more than a century of rigorous fire suppression, have all contributed to what is now a full-blown wildfire and forest health crisis. And this is really specifically talking to the West. So while I'm not picking on the West or picking on California, and I might be in some ways, but I kind of wanted to contrast how the differences in Georgia and out West, and I'll use California as an example, contribute to what we see in the news. So there are a number of issues that play into the wildfire risk and danger that we see out West. The first of those is climate and climate change. So the climate out West, and especially in California, is getting warmer, drier, and windier. They have, the Santa Ana winds and other warm, dry winds that we thankfully don't really have here in Georgia, that exacerbates a lot of their fires. But their forest management practices play a big role in this. So in Georgia, 90% of our forest land is privately owned. While it's not exactly inverse, it's out West, it's not the case. Most of their land is publicly owned with fewer private lands. So that makes it harder to harvest. There's a lot more restrictions and permitting that go into harvesting timber out West than they do here in Georgia. And so with less harvesting, that means that there's older trees growing, and then higher fuel loads that accumulate on the ground. And certainly with little to no prescribed burning that they've done over the past century, those fuel loads just keep accumulating over time. I mentioned this earlier, but land ownership plays a big role in this. Being the federal government owns, for California as an example, about 60% of forest land across the state. And so while the Forest Service has plans to implement fuel reduction and fuel mitigation strategies, oftentimes their budgets don't allow for it, and they're spending so much money focused on the wildfires that do pop up that they don't really have the funding to do some of the more preventative maintenance. So it turns into a kind of a vicious cycle. The wildland urban interface that was highlighted in that quote before, the WUI, plays a big role, especially in the removal of fire from the landscape. When you think about homes outside of LA and up in Napa and Sonoma and Northern California that are, up in the hills outside of the city in these, really beautiful areas. These are also areas where that fire return interval is 1 to 3 years. And so when you build, and not just out west, anywhere in the country, when you build in a area with a really frequent fire regime, that puts development and fire at odds with each other, and they don't mix well. Liability is a big issue, and that plays into one of the reasons they don't have as much prescribed burning out west. So here in the Southeast, burn bosses, as long as they do their burn plan and get their permits and aren't grossly negligent, they're protected. They have some liability protections in the event a fire escapes or something goes wrong. As long as they did what they should, they're covered. That liability protection doesn't exist out west. So when you take that, compound it with the higher fuel loads and a lot of times the warmer and drier climate they have, it makes people very reluctant and hesitant to burn. And then, just like Atlanta, we're kind of facing some of our air quality challenges here. Those are much greater out west. And again, that just makes burning that much harder. But all's not lost. And there's some good news on the horizon. And again, just this Tuesday, the U.S. Forest Service and the USDA announced they're confronting the wildfire crisis program. So this is a 10-year strategy that the U.S. Forest Service is undertaking. And they'll be investing $3 billion from the recently passed infrastructure bill to really focus on the wildfire crisis. And again, this is really specifically focused out west, and they'll focus on higher risk fire sheds. A fire shed is, if you kind of think of a similar to what you think of as a watershed. These are areas that are roughly about 250,000 acres in size, and they're developed kind of based on surrounding communities and infrastructure in the area. So they'll identify the highest risk of those fire sheds and target those. And the funds will be used for fuel reduction and forest health treatments on up to 20 million acres of additional National Forest Service land, and then up to 30 million acres of other federal, state, tribal, and privately owned land. So it's a much needed step. It's a step in the right direction. But when you think about 20 million acres of land, that's basically not quite how much forest land we have here in Georgia. So there's still a lot more that needs to be done, but at least the Forest Service is starting to move in the right direction. So I'll wrap it up here with a couple. If you don't remember anything else that I've talked about, these are some of the key takeaways that I hope you leave with, and those being that fire is a really essential and necessary component to the ecosystem, and it's vital to ensuring the long-term health and sustainability of Georgia's forests. A number of plant and animal species here in the South and in Georgia depend on regular fire, and most of that being like a 1 to 3 year fire for survival. And so despite fire being removed from the landscape for close to a century, efforts are underway to reintroduce the fire to the landscape nationally. But fire, I'd say, has definitely returned in a great way in the South. And active forest management in the Southeast and our forestry practices here really help prevent those major wildfires that we see in the news out west. And lastly, fire is here I said one of, I'll change that to say fire is probably the best tool that not just foresters but land managers have, whether it's managing for ag or pasture or wildlife or timber. Fire is a great tool, and it's a good thing. With that, I'll wrap. My email address is here. I'm happy to answer some questions now, and then certainly feel free to reach out to me in the future.
Thank you, Nick. Looks like we've already got a lot of questions rolling in, but first off, I just thank you again for presenting tonight. And yeah, that was a great little summation of fire ecology here in the Southeast and really across the country. So yeah, we've already got a good number of questions. I think we can just get rolling.
Great.
We'll just start up here at the top. So William Bishop asks, what factors impact the decision to burn during the growing season versus the dormant season?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, there's a couple different things that play into it. One of them is it's, weather is really the primary factor. And historically, most of the prescribed burns were in the dormant season, where they just kind of run those quick low intensity fires to clear out needles and brush and other debris. Growing season burns are a little bit more challenging because they're done in the summer when it's typically hotter and drier. Although here in the South, humidity helps with that. But growing season burns are great at removing and killing off some of the competing understory brush. And so if you have some really heavy, if you haven't burned in a while, you've got some really thick, kind of hardwood competitor species that are coming up. Growing season burns are great at wiping those out. The challenge with them is they can get hot, they can get intense pretty quick. So you have to be careful and make sure that the conditions align. But now there's a lot more focus and emphasis on doing growing season burns for those reasons, where that hasn't always been the case.
Great question, William. Hope that answered that for you. So our next question is from Heather Tubbs, who asks, how are those species helped by fire? Can you elaborate? And I think she must be alluding to the slide you had with you had pitcher plant, I believe, and gopher tortoise and some other species.
Yeah, so it helps them, for longleaf pine. I'll start there. They need, I mentioned that they're relatively slow growing trees, probably the slowest growing that we have in the South. And so because of that, they can quickly be overcome by faster growing competitor species. That can be loblolly pine, or it can be in the South like sweet gum and turkey oak and some of the other scrub oaks that pop up. So fire keeps those competing species at bay and gives longleaf the time to grow. And then some of those other species being quail, the gopher tortoise, indigo snake, red-cockaded woodpecker, they also need those relatively open understories, the kind of longleaf pine savanna, for their survival. And so, quail need a lot of native grasses for them to kind of hide and bury in. But if they get too many hardwoods and other woody species competing with them, it'll choke them out. And then same with some of the orchids and the pitcher plants. They need that regular fire, if nothing else, to help reduce competition and keep things nice and open the way that they like it.
All right, we have a question from Gail Jane Waitley, who asks, does fire release CO2 back into the atmosphere after living trees have sequestered that carbon?
It does. And so that's why when you look at forests across the country now, a lot of the forests out west, when we think about carbon, and look at forests, we think of them as either a carbon sink, where they're taking in more carbon and absorbing it, or a carbon source, where they're emitting more carbon than they take in. So most of the forests out west are a carbon source. The trees are growing, but these really high intensity fires that come through burn everything release all that carbon in the atmosphere, and then they end up releasing more than what the trees are taking in. That's not the case here in the Southeast. So in the Southeast, our forests are one of the largest carbon sinks in North America and probably even the world. And so yes, these fires do come through and release that carbon back in the atmosphere. That carbon would be released anyway, just through the natural degradation processes. But with these frequent low interval or low intensity fires, the carbon that's reduced is relatively minimal and is vastly outweighed by what the trees uptake. So it's still a net carbon sink. And these frequent fires and low intensity fires ensure that it stays a carbon sink. If we didn't burn for 100 years and we had a crown fire come through, then all of that carbon gets released back in the atmosphere.
All right, we have another question from William Bishop, who asks, are there any changes to prescribed burn techniques that make them more suitable to the type of environment out west?
You know, one of the challenges with fire is that we can do our best to control it, but fire is fire. It's kind of its own beast. It creates its own weather with big enough fires. So there are some techniques in how you start the fires and how you light the fires and let them burn that can minimize their severity and impact and minimize the risk of them turning into a high intensity fire. The biggest challenge out west is that they just have so much fuel accumulated that if you do any type of prescribed fire, it's like lighting a matchbox. And so out west will pretty much have to be a combination of going through and doing some mechanical treatment, basically going through and chopping up and shredding the accumulated fuel that's out there. So doing some mechanical treatment before coming in with fire, just to try and reduce that fuel load and keep the fires manageable. Hopefully that answers that question. And I don't know if I froze up or if Ian froze up. All right, I see Lloyd, so I don't think I'm frozen.
Fortunately, it seems like Ian has frozen up.
Okay. Well, I'll keep running here for a little bit on some of the questions that I can see. So there's a question on the management of the Okefenokee, and if that comes under my our land management. So the Okefenokee is federally managed, and then a lot of that is wilderness area. And so wilderness, that's a whole nother topic, or a whole nother webinar. Some of the challenges with, when I say wilderness as capital W, federally designated wilderness, is that in establishing a wilderness area, it's basically intended to leave alone, don't touch it. You can't use any nothing other than hand tools, nothing mechanical to get in there. So a lot of with fire in wilderness, the policy is just let it burn, really, until it gets to a property boundary or starts encroaching on a property boundary. But for the most part, with fire in wilderness area, it's the federal policy is to let it burn. So next question I see is, you mentioned that fire is the most effective tool for management, including invasive species. You have specific examples of when invasive species in the landscape interfered with fire management, such as preventing prescribed fire or changing a fire from a surface to a crown. So the fire invasive species themselves won't prevent or really alter a prescribed fire. Where they can get challenging is, a lot of invasive species grow very fast, very quick, and very dense. And so if you have a really thick understory of privet, Chinese privet, for example, and you try and burn that, that's going to be a hot, intense fire. And so that's why it's really important to get in there and keep these regular 1 to 3 year fires, so if you're in the coastal plain, to keep privet and some of those other invasives at bay, because they're not adapted to fire. They can't tolerate it. They will be killed during these low intensity fires. And then, so I've seen a couple of questions about animals and wildlife during fires. Wildlife, again, especially here in the South and in these fire adapted ecosystems, they've lived with fire forever. A lot of them need it. So, they do a really good job of, when there's a wildfire or controlled burn, they get out of the way. And then almost immediately after the burn goes through, after it's out, you'll see deer back in, wandering through the stand. You'll see the box turtles out. So, controlled burning really rarely, because they are low intensity, really rarely has any detrimental impacts on wildlife. And one question that jumps out to me here is, how does GFF regard the practice of clear cutting tree plantations when harvesting trees? We encourage it. The great thing, clear cutting gets a bad rap. The great thing about forestry is it's renewable. And so Georgia plants anywhere from 240 to 300 million trees every year, vastly more than we harvest. And so when you see, I guess maybe I should clarify that a little bit. When you see a clear cut, especially on plantation land, almost all the time within a year, the landowner will come back and replant with 400 to 600 trees per acre. Now, where we don't like to see clear cutting is if they clear cut to convert to a non-forest use or development use. But in terms of clear cutting for harvesting trees, Georgia harvests more trees than any state in the country, and that really leads to our healthy forest. But in turn, we also plant more trees than any state in the country as well. So I see one here. Please clarify what determines when to do a controlled burn. So that will come down to the management objective. So most land managers and certainly forest landowners in the state will have a forest management plan that kind of clearly defines what's out there, what species are there, what ages it is, broken down by stand, and what their objectives are in terms of management. Are they managing it purely for timber? Are they managing it for timber and wildlife, or for hunting? Do they want it for recreation? Do they want it for conservation and just let the trees grow and they're not concerned about harvesting? But that forest management plan will really dictate kind of what goes on in the future, and also that plan itself will dictate the burn interval. And so most forest stands in Georgia, again, are burned every 2 to 3 years. And so some of the, certainly larger landowners will have different stands across their property in different rotations. So they know each year they're burning, at some point, these blocks of their land. They'll do the rest of the group the following year and then come back and just kind of keep repeating that over and over again. But it really relates back to a management plan and the landowner objectives.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one last question.
Sure. All right, so I see one here. As residents of Georgia, how can we best support our forests? That's a great question, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. The first is, we are all consumers of forest products, whether it be cardboard boxes from Amazon or toilet paper, paper towels, but supporting buying forest products and paper and everything that they come from is great. Supporting, put in a plug for us. I mean, we really work to ensure that the longevity of Georgia's forests. So we do a lot of work with other organizations across the state on education and really connecting people back to the forest. And so we would certainly appreciate your support there. But I think probably the biggest thing, especially I'm in Atlanta. I'm sure a lot of you all are based in Metro Atlanta. There's understanding forestry and our forests in the state, and that forests are a renewable resource. They are a great benefit to the state, environmentally, economically, and advocating for forests and the forestry industry in the state. And if there are any questions I didn't get to, feel free to, my email's here, feel free to reach out. I love fire and happy to continue talking about this.
All right, thanks so much, Nick. And thanks for everyone who came out. Sorry, I was experiencing some internet connectivity issues there for a second, but seems like everything's working okay now. What I wanted to do though is share my screen. Yes. And just let you all know about what we have coming up. So again, we are recording this, and the recording will be available on our website. Generally takes somewhere between like 3 to 4 days to get it up on our website. And the link is there. What I recommend doing though is if you're ever just want to look up our Science Cafe website, just Google search Science Cafe Atlanta, and that'll be the first thing that pops up. And you can also view not only this one, but all of our previous webinars that we've done. And also, we've got a webinar coming up next month. That's going to be Thursday, February 17th with Namrata Pradhan. It was a PhD student at the Guangxi Key Laboratory of Forest Ecology and Conservation at Guangxi University in China. And she's going to be presenting on seed viability testing for the research and conservation of epiphytic and terrestrial orchids. So we're really excited to have her. And in particular, I know Jason Ligon, our seed bank and micropropagation lab coordinator, is really excited to have her, and he'll be joining for that as well. And also just want to share my email there. That's isabo@AtlantaBG. If anybody has any questions or suggestions for future events, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. And something else I should mention is, right now we're doing this in virtual format, and we will continue to do that through April, but we're hoping to start doing these events in person at Day Hall at the Atlanta Botanical Garden in Midtown, starting in May. So of course, that'll be dependent on what COVID is up to, but that is our hope, to start doing these in person again. So we'll see how that goes. If you all would like to check out our website and specifically see what we're up to here at the Conservation and Research Department, there is the link for that. It's at atlantabg.org/conservation-research. And we also have an Instagram account that we encourage you all to follow, and that is at Atlanta BG Conservation. Thanks again, everybody, for coming out tonight, and hope to see you next month.